hit the button.
Yes. Thank you very much.
The button has been hit.
Thank you very much. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this seminar hosted by the Deakin Science and Society Network. I'm Timothy Neale. I'm an associate professor in anthropology here at Deakin, and I'm one of the stream leaders in environmental challenges in the Deakin Science and Society Network, which is our host. I'd like to begin this session by acknowledging that we meet on the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects and acknowledge their elders past, present, and emerging, and I'll acknowledge also the Indigenous traditional owners of the land of where people are listening in from, because I know we have a lot of people joining us online today. Just for a little background, the Science and Society Network was formed in 2018 in recognition that scientists and humanities and social science researchers need to work together on the great challenges of this time. No single academic field can bring about the changes that we need to see in the world. Bridging disciplinary divides is the key to finding new solutions to the problems we face. The Science and Society Network supports early and mid-career researchers in particular across Deakin University who are embarking on groundbreaking interdisciplinary projects. That's our purpose, and that's what we've been doing for a number of years now. In fact, we've been doing it for 6 years, and I should mention that we are doing a 6-year retrospective here at Deakin Downtown on July the 8th. Do look it up and register if you'd like to come along. In a moment, I'll introduce our speaker, Andrew Lakoff, who is going to give a presentation of 40 to 45 minutes. And then we're going to move to some discussion here in the room, and we'll take some questions online as well. So please, I'll be chairing the discussion here at Deakin Downtown, and my colleague Karina Traits is moderating the chat on YouTube. And we're keen to hear and answer your questions. So you can either post your questions into the YouTube chat. If you're here in the room, you can raise your hand. You can send them to us on Blue Sky. You can email them to us, ssn-info@deakin.edu.au. Okay, without further ado, and with that preamble said, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Andrew Lakoff is Professor of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Southern California, where he directs the Center on Science, Technology, and Public Life. A center, from what I understand, that sounds a lot like what we do here at the Science and Society Network. His most recent book, as he's going to be discussing today, is Planning for the Wrong Pandemic, published by Polity Press in 2024. And his other books include, with Stephen Collier, The Government of Emergency, Vital Systems Expertise and the Politics of Security, published in 2021, Unprepared, Global Health in a Time of Emergency, published in 2017, and Pharmaceutical Reason, Knowledge and Value in Global Psychiatry, published in 2005. So I'd like you to all join me in welcoming Andy to the stage for this exciting presentation on planning for the wrong pandemic.
Thank you so much, Tim, for the introduction, and to the Science and Society Network for the invitation. Thanks all of you for coming, and thanks for those of you who are online for joining us virtually. I have to say that after the last 4 months in the US, it's really been a relief to be on a continent far away, and a special pleasure to have the chance to visit Melbourne for the first time. We had a really interesting workshop yesterday on the theme of climate emergency, and afterwards at dinner, Tim happened to relay some advice that he had given to graduate students a few years ago about what they should be working on. He said they should absolutely not write about COVID-19 since everyone else is writing about it already. It's good advice, and it probably would have been good for me to follow it. Unfortunately, I didn't get it on time. And so I have this book that I'm going to share with you about the US response to COVID-19, but hopefully will be interesting and illuminative to contrast the experience in the US to that of Australia. So let me begin with a word on how I came to write the book. And it's a kind of accidental sequel to a book that Tim mentioned that I published a couple of years ago. There's the wrong one. There we go. Called Unprepared, Global Health in a Time of Emergency. So in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, I found myself in something of an awkward position for a scholar of science and technology studies, which was I was seen as a kind of expert in pandemic preparedness for having written this book. So journalists who had gotten hold of the book, or at least seen its title, mistakenly credited me with prescience, asking, well, can you tell us why the US seems to have been caught so unprepared for a pandemic? And how should our public health authorities be responding differently? I would try to explain that, in fact, the book's title was not meant as a diagnosis or a call to arms, and I was not myself an expert in managing the spread of infectious disease. Rather, the book named an ethos and a form of rationality that I had encountered among a group of experts in global health. And the book sought to characterize what I called an event in thought, that is, the invention of a new way of approaching the uncertain and potentially catastrophic future. This wasn't actually a satisfying answer for the journalists and others who were seeking my expert advice. In any case, what was striking to me in the early stages of the pandemic in the US was not so much that public health authorities were unprepared for a pandemic. In fact, many of the expert concepts and tools that I had traced in my prior work were quickly brought to bear to address it. But they were, in many cases, not working as had been planned. And this observation led me to a few small pieces of writing and eventually to this new book, which asks what happens when an apparatus designed for acting on an uncertain future is brought to bear to address an unfolding event in the present. And the book tells this story through the example of 6 anticipatory devices that became objects of puzzlement or contestation during the first year of the pandemic, again in the US. And in the talk, I'll describe a few of these devices listed here on the right and try to situate them in relation to the broader argument of the book. But I want to start not in 2020, but about 50 years before that, with a historical vignette that I think helps frame some of the problems that were at stake for expert knowledge during the COVID-19 pandemic. So in the summer of 1969, a US Public Health Service officer named Robert Price traveled to the Biafra region of Nigeria as part of an airlift of relief supplies coordinated by religious groups and supported by the Nixon administration to address the humanitarian crisis driven by the ongoing civil war in the country. Due to a blockade by the Nigerian military, the civilian population in the South faced dire shortages of essential supplies, including food and medicine. The US airlift included 12 packaged disaster hospitals, seen here being unloaded at a port in Lagos. These 200-bed hospitals were designed to be assembled in any available structure like a school or a church. Each of the hospitals weighed 25 tons and was packed in 485 separate crates. Price accompanied one of these hospitals on a river journey to the city of Port Harcourt on the southern coast, where it was set up in an abandoned general hospital and put to use to address the population's urgent health needs. In an article published the following year, Price described his experience with the packaged hospital in Port Harcourt. He noted that the conflict in Nigeria and its aftermath had provided the first real opportunity to use these units in their entirety and to assess the usefulness of the concept of the portable disaster hospital. While there were certain needs in Port Harcourt that the packaged supplies could not address, they didn't have medications for parasitic disease, Price's overall assessment was positive. The hospital was assembled rapidly, its wheeled cots and other equipment functioned well, and stored supplies like intravenous recipient kits had saved the lives of badly malnourished children. Put to their first complete test, he concluded the hospitals had performed magnificently. But what exactly had the experience in Nigeria been a test of? The answer is hinted at here in Price's allusion to the portable hospital's capacity to provide care for large numbers of casualties in a situation in which critical facilities are inoperative and supplies essential to survival are lacking. The hospitals had been initially stored with a very different future use in view. Beginning in the early 1950s, the Federal Civil Defense Administration had built around 2,500 of these hospitals as part of its medical stockpiling program in anticipation of a Soviet nuclear attack on American population centers. These packaged hospitals were stored in hundreds of strategic spots around the US, outside of urban centers, but close enough to be accessible to civilians fleeing attacks on cities. Based on the advice of a panel of experts on what supplies would be needed to treat atomic bomb casualties, civil defense officials had compiled a standard set of 650 essential items, including pharmaceuticals and surgical supplies, as well as equipment to generate electricity and to pump water. It was an inventory of basic medical needs in an imagined future world of infrastructural collapse. As the destructive power of nuclear weapons increased, so too did the demand to add to the medical stockpile. However, by the late 1960s, the American public was increasingly disillusioned with the idea that such measures could mitigate the catastrophic effects of a nuclear attack. And there was little support, either for the acquisition of more supplies or for the maintenance and care of existing ones. The civil defense stockpile was both increasingly obsolete and too expensive to upgrade. It was in this context that Price reported on the efficacy of the packaged hospital in Nigeria. The setting in Port Harcourt was an opportunity to see how the stockpiled medical supplies would function in what he called the hostile environment of a post-nuclear attack United States. The experience in Nigeria, he wrote, demonstrated the usefulness of the concept of a packaged, quickly activated hospital and justified the modest expense necessary to maintain readiness to respond to disaster. Price's advocacy for the packaged disaster hospital was not, however, enough to garner congressional support for the medical stockpiling program. It was difficult to command sustained investment in readiness for an event that might never occur. 3 years later, the program was canceled for budgetary reasons, and its trove of supplies was quietly disposed of. I'll return later to the theme of medical stockpiling, but for now I want to mention a couple of reasons I find Price's discussion of the use of the packaged disaster hospital to be illuminating. First, it points to the more general concept underlying a program of stockpiling, the need to plan for survival in an envisioned future of infrastructural collapse. Second, it points to mid-century war mobilization as the matrix for techniques of preparedness that would later be applied to other domains, such as infectious disease. And third, it demonstrates that in building a stockpile, one does not know how or indeed whether its contents will eventually be used. More generally, we can think of the stockpile as a kind of time capsule. A past vision of the future is embedded in its inventory of the items that will be needed should that future come to pass. To break open the stockpile's crates in the face of an emergency is to see what was planned for, what should have been packed but was neglected, what was included but turned out not to be needed. Unpacking the stockpile might be thought of as a kind of material history of the present, through which we can see how a prior context structures our ability to respond to a new situation. This is the genealogical question: how our current ways of thinking are constrained by the conditions in which our concepts were formed, as Ian Hacking puts it here, that I pose to the various anticipatory devices that were activated at the outset of the pandemic. So let me now turn to the early stages of the pandemic response in the United States. We're very, very ready for this. At a press conference in late February 2020, President Trump was introducing his coronavirus task force to an assembled group of reporters. Only 15 cases of COVID had so far been reported in the United States, and the president expressed confidence that his administration's policies would keep the disease from spreading widely. Over the next year, of course, this optimism would prove tragically ill-founded as the estimated number of American deaths caused by the disease climbed to 500,000 and beyond. The country's disorganized and fractious response to the pandemic prompted many observers to ask, why had the United States, given its wealth and its technical capacities, been caught so apparently unprepared? Critics pointed to a number of candidates for blame: a president who was dismissive of scientific expertise, a decentralized public health system that had long been starved of resources, a fragmented media landscape that enabled misinformation to prosper, pre-existing social disparities that heightened inequities in the impact of the disease, and more. But at least in this case, there was a certain basis to the president's bombast. US officials and experts had been anticipating and preparing for a catastrophic disease outbreak for more than 2 decades. In the late 1990s, the Department of Health and Human Services established a trove of medical countermeasures to be used in a future health emergency. In 2005, the White House released a national strategy for pandemic influenza. Meanwhile, think tanks and federal agencies held a series of exercises designed to test the government's response to a biological emergency. and the National Institutes of Health provided millions of dollars in support for basic research to enable the detection and containment of emerging pathogens. Having invested in these and other measures, the United States was widely considered to be the world's leader in pandemic preparedness. In fact, as he introduced his task force, President Trump held aloft a page from a report on the country's best and worst prepared for an epidemic. I'm not sure if you can read the small writing there. And he emphasized the expert provenance of this report. You can see in his handwriting, it says Johns Hopkins on the cover. And the report ranked the US first in its readiness among 195 World Health Organization member states. I'll return to the report, which became somewhat infamous later in the talk. Not only had the US government been preparing for such an event over the prior 2 decades, but many of its plans were rapidly implemented in the first months of the pandemic. Let's take, for example, the concept of flattening the curve, which seemed to appear out of nowhere in March 2020, but which played a major role in guiding the early US public health response to COVID. The concept was accompanied by an image of 2 epidemic trajectories, one steeper and shorter in duration than the other. It was an image of 2 potential futures. In the future in which we did not take the necessary actions, an influx of patients would overwhelm the healthcare system. Medical personnel would fall sick, essential supplies would fall short, and ICUs would overflow with desperately ill patients. In the other future, the one represented by the flatter curve, our interventions would slow the rate of disease transmission and extend the total number of cases over a longer period, securing the continuous operation of the health system. So in this quick quotation from Governor Cuomo of New York, you can see how the concept of flattening the curve structured public health decision-making. The imposition of social distancing measures such as school and business closures was, as Cuomo put it here, all about ensuring that sufficient beds and ventilators would remain available, that an influx of patients would not overwhelm the system. To flatten the curve was a collective injunction pointing to actions that health authorities, as well as normal citizens, could take to address the pandemic emergency. Shift schools to remote learning, work from home, cancel gatherings, close public spaces. The image of an epidemic trajectory whose future contours would be shaped by our present actions helped make the otherwise invisible specter of a rapidly spreading virus into something that could be understood and worked on. At the same time, authorities' efforts to flatten the curve had certain side effects that only became apparent as the pandemic wore on. For one, the social distancing measures designed to slow the rate of disease transmission had starkly unequal effects. Some employees were able to smoothly shift to working from home, whereas others lost their jobs as stores and restaurants were shuttered. Similarly, students' ability to adapt to remote learning differed in relation to the wealth of their households and the means of their school districts. Moreover, it was unclear how long the policies enacted to flatten the curve would have to be in force. As the period of social distancing extended indefinitely, political struggles erupted over such issues as the authority of the state to govern individual behavior, the validity of expert knowledge claims, and how to balance the benefits of slowing disease transmission against the economic and social costs of shutdowns. To understand why these side effects had not been foreseen, it's helpful to look at the context in which the concept of flattening the curve was first introduced. In the mid-2000s, health authorities were gravely worried that the H5N1 strain of avian influenza, which had a case fatality ratio in the range of 40 or 50%, would mutate to become easily transmissible among humans. It was a prospect that raised the question of how to manage a highly virulent and rapidly spreading disease in the absence of biomedical interventions. At the time, a group of historians proposed a novel approach, drawing on archival research comparing different US cities' responses to the 1918 pandemic. The historians had found that cities that prohibited social gatherings in anticipation of an epidemic wave had fared better than those that did not. And based on these findings, the group supported the incorporation of what were called non-pharmaceutical interventions, later known as social distancing measures, into the federal government's influenza pandemic plans. The CDC adopted this approach in a 2007 pre-pandemic planning guidance that laid out a strategy for community mitigation to ensure that a surge of patients would not overwhelm medical services or stress critical infrastructures. 13 years later, in early 2020, with no biomedical interventions available to manage the novel coronavirus, the concept of flattening the curve was ready to hand, laying out a goal that could be accomplished through the available means. But the measure had been envisioned in relation to a different virus, one with different characteristics. As one of the historians who had provided the rationale for the strategy later recalled, his team had not imagined a stubborn, persistent pathogen like the novel coronavirus. Rather, he said, we were thinking of influenza. With flu in mind, they had assumed that social distancing measures would be necessary for just a few months before a vaccine became available, or the epidemic wave receded as temperatures rose in the spring. And given its focus on reducing rates of transmission of the disease, the group had not considered the political conflicts that its recommended measures might spark. Critics would later suggest that the shutdown policy had been imposed without adequate discussion of its potential costs and benefits. For instance, in a recent diagnosis of the failures of expert knowledge during the pandemic, two political scientists argue that insofar as the situation was understood as an emergency, it was impossible to balance competing interests, to weigh the different values at stake. And I would say that such a reading is only possible in retrospect. In fact, devices like flattening the curve were designed precisely for a situation in which a policy decision has to be made before there is enough data available to assess its costs and benefits. In this sense, the concept of flattening the curve was just one element within a broader framework of preparedness that guided the US government's early response to the novel coronavirus. As authorities sought to address an urgent and uncertain situation, they relied on a set of available concepts and tools, organizational schemes, modes of classification, regulatory protocols that had been previously devised for managing a future emergency. This heterogeneous set of devices enabled officials to take hold of the event and to rapidly implement policies in response. In this sense, the pandemic should not be seen as an external visitation that unfolded independently of our ways of understanding and managing it. Rather, it was in relation to such devices that it was constituted as a comprehensible event. At the same time, however, the actual pandemic as it unfolded defied many of the assumptions that were embedded in these devices. This ensemble of concepts and techniques had been put together by an array of experts and officials over the course of several decades in anticipation of a range of potential catastrophes, from nuclear war to major natural disasters to a mass casualty terrorist attack. And I allude here to the concept of dispositif, or apparatus, to emphasize that these concepts are generative, they're productive of the targets into which they intervene, and that they can arise in relation to one problem site, but then are able to extend their range to other domains. Two prior periods are especially important in this regard. The first, which Stephen Collier and I examine in our book, The Government of Emergency, is the early Cold War, when mobilization planners were charged to prepare for an unprecedented event, a nuclear attack on the United States. The problem that they sought to address, which political scientist Clinton Rossiter glibly describes here, was how to ensure the continued operation of the nation's critical systems, not only of government, but also energy, transportation, food provision, and so on, in the aftermath of such an attack. The mobilizers developed a schema of emergency government that included tools for mitigating urban vulnerability, plans for allocating resources in a crippled economy, and a blueprint for the reorganization of government to address the pressing demands of a wartime emergency. And this schema was designed to enable the executive to flexibly intervene in a post-attack emergency without declaring a state of exception. Over the course of the 1950s, security planners honed this schema of emergency government through a program of test exercises that simulated the effects of an attack, exposing gaps in preparedness that could then be addressed through revised mobilization plans. The second key period begins roughly 4 decades later, when these existing techniques for governing an emergency were redeployed to address the newly perceived threat of a catastrophic disease outbreak. In the late 1990s, incited as the story goes by Bill Clinton's encounter with a suspense novel by Richard Preston, US security officials raised alarms about the prospect of a biological attack by a rogue state or a terrorist organization. And this concern led in 1999 to the establishment of a new medical stockpile, which I'll talk about more later. And after the 2001 anthrax letters to initiatives such as Project BioShield, which charged the federal government to procure new drugs and vaccines through contracts with biotech and pharmaceutical companies. Meanwhile, after the 2003 SARS epidemic and as the specter of avian influenza loomed, these biological preparedness efforts were extended to address naturally occurring infectious diseases. Federal agencies developed pandemic plans, antiviral drugs were added to the stockpile, and the NIH sought to incentivize innovation in vaccine development. In turn, these efforts expanded internationally as US officials pushed for investment in the new field of global health security. With support from the US CDC, the World Health Organization adopted a set of regulations focused on the detection and containment of emerging diseases. As the nation that had initiated such efforts, the US was arguably the driving force in the global extension of pandemic preparedness. It's not so much that the United States found itself unprepared for disease emergency in early 2020 then, but rather that officials and experts had been anticipating something different. From the early stages of the pandemic, a set of concepts and techniques that had been developed in relation to prior contexts was applied to a novel virus. The availability of these devices made it possible to act on an unfolding situation even as its contours were not yet well understood, but it also led to blind spots and unanticipated outcomes, in many cases due to assumptions that were built into the framework of preparedness. So let me take another of these anticipatory devices as an example, the category of essential workers, which was introduced in tandem with authorities' early efforts to flatten the curve of disease incidence. The category was used to identify groups whose continued work on site was deemed necessary in order to keep critical systems like transportation and food production operational, while much of social and economic life was shut down. It soon became an object of political contention, as those workers deemed essential often did not have the privilege of avoiding the risk of infection. At the same time, various industries, from cannabis sellers to gun manufacturers, sought to be reclassified as essential so that they could avoid the shutdown of their operations. Less well understood in these discussions was the background to this technique of classification. In the late 1990s, in response to newly perceived security threats arising from dependence on information and communication technology, a presidential commission was charged to study the critical infrastructures that constitute the life support systems of our nation, determine their vulnerabilities, and propose a strategy for protecting them into the future. The Office of Cybersecurity and Infrastructure in the newly formed Department of Homeland Security was eventually given the task of implementing this policy. And 2 decades later, at the outset of the pandemic, it was this office that identified the categories of essential critical infrastructure workers who would be required to stay on site during the shutdown. But the genealogy of critical infrastructure as a concept can be traced back further to a mid-century understanding of collective life as dependent on a set of vulnerable vital systems. This understanding initially arose in the context of interwar air targeting, as articulated here by the air power theorist William Sherman. During World War II, with the help of industrial economists, the approach was then applied by bombing strategists to find key nodes in the enemy's military-industrial production process. The style of reasoning then was transposed to domestic vital systems in the US as part of Cold War nuclear preparedness. As you can see here in the table of contents of a 1957 war mobilization plan. According to the plan, measures to protect critical resources in areas such as telecommunication, power, and transportation would make it possible to rebuild the nation in the aftermath of a crippling atomic attack. Nearly 7 decades later, in 2020, a mode of classification originally devised to reduce vulnerability at the level of the system had introduced a novel form of risk at the level of the individual, the risk of being classified as essential. So the book's emphasis in general is on the US response to the pandemic, but the application of these concepts and techniques was not limited to a single national context. As you probably know, in Australia, scenario-based exercises had been conducted by numerous national governments and multinational institutions. Other countries had built up medical stockpiles and made preparedness plans. What was perhaps distinctive to the US was the striking disjuncture between expectations of governmental capacity on the one hand and actual performance on the other. So this disjuncture was highlighted by the report that I mentioned earlier, which ranked the US at the top of all WHO member nations in its readiness to deal with the threat of an epidemic or pandemic. The report, called the Global Health Security Index, was released in October 2019, just a couple of months before the emergence of the coronavirus, by two Washington, D.C.-based policy organizations. By the end of 2020, despite its impressive ranking in the index, the mortality rate from COVID in the US was significantly higher than that of lower-ranked countries. Here's a set of rankings if you can read them on the index, including Australia, Germany, and South Korea. This disjuncture between expectations and reality led to the question, insofar as it had been supposed to be equipped to handle a pandemic, as the Washington Post put it, how could the country now find itself among the hardest hit nations in the world? Critical analysts tended to address this puzzle through the lens of their own assessments of the country's failed response. For some, the disjuncture pointed to the Trump administration's abject failure of leadership. For others, blame lay with a hidebound public health bureaucracy incapable of flexible response. For still others, the problem was that the kinds of collective capacities needed to successfully manage a pandemic, such as political will, inevitably eluded quantitative measurement. But I think the puzzle can be more helpfully addressed by asking what the preparedness indicator was actually initially meant to accomplish. What problem was it invented to solve? The concept had been introduced in a very different context in the aftermath of the catastrophic 2014 Ebola epidemic in West Africa. In post hoc assessments of the global health community's response to Ebola, a shared diagnosis of the failure was that resource-poor countries in the global south, such as Ivory Coast or Liberia, lacked what were called core capacities to detect and contain an outbreak before it spread to threaten the rest of the world. The categories that the index wanted to measure are listed here. Global health security advocates sought to garner aid from the world of international development to improve these core capacities in resource-poor countries. So the Global Health Security Index, like other development indices, was designed as a tool for assessing the efficacy of this development aid. As it turned out, the capacities for outbreak detection and response that the index emphasized in its measurements were not especially helpful in managing the coronavirus once it had spread beyond containment. It was not so much then that the Global Health Security Index had measured national levels of preparedness incorrectly, as that national preparedness, as measured by the index, turned out to be a solution to a different set of problems than those posed by COVID-19. Let me turn to another anticipatory device, the scenario-based exercise. Defending the apparent chaos and disarray of the federal government's early response, the president argued in March that nobody in their wildest dreams would have ever anticipated an event like COVID-19. In fact, it was quickly pointed out, executive branch agencies in his own White House had seemingly done just that in a series of test exercises that envisioned a future pandemic. Indeed, just a few months before the emergence of COVID-19, the Department of Health and Human Services had conducted a four-day test exercise called Crimson Contagion, in which a novel strain of avian influenza originates in China and rapidly spreads via human-to-human transmission around the world and to the continental US. It was further noted that this exercise had anticipated a number of the problems that would emerge in early 2020. Why, critics ask, had these problems not been addressed? Here, again, it's helpful to consider what a scenario-based exercise is designed to accomplish. Like critical infrastructure protection, the device dates from mid-20th century planning for a future nuclear attack. At the time, mobilization planners faced the question, how can we anticipate and plan for an event that has never occurred? The scenario-based exercise served, as one of its inventors put it, as a continuous and effective way of enlisting and applying brainpower to the ramifications of an unknown problem. So by simulating the event, one could expose vulnerabilities in the response system and galvanize resources to address these vulnerabilities in advance of the event's occurrence. Scenario planners typically designed their exercises to draw attention to a particular problem or question that had already arisen in planning efforts. So for example, the Operation Alert exercises of the mid-1950s highlighted questions regarding the chain of command in a post-attack situation. Who would direct the provision of relief to civilians? What role would the military play in case of a breakdown of social order? The lessons learned from these exercises then pointed to the need for revisions to the plan for post-attack government organization. Similarly, in 2019, the Office of Preparedness and Response designed Crimson Contagion to address problems of government organization that needed clarification. Which federal agency would lead the response to a pandemic? What legislation would be required to authorize the release of federal funds? How might existing plans need to be revised to address these questions? Insofar as the experience of the exercise pointed to other problems that then arose during the pandemic the following year, such as how to manage the cascading effects of school closures, the Crimson Contagion After Action report didn't make any recommendations on reforms, but merely suggested that future exercises should also include the examination of the political aspects involved in managing pandemics. So like the nuclear preparedness exercises of the 1950s, Crimson Contagion had a narrowly defined purview. It was designed not so much to open up novel areas to scrutiny as to galvanize attention to already identified targets of internal reform. The question posed by the scenario-based exercise of what kind of event one should be planning for brings us back to the theme that I began with, medical stockpiling. Early in 2020, the public learned about a previously classified storehouse of essential medical supplies known as the Strategic National Stockpile, managed by the Office of Preparedness and Response. Dispersed in 6 classified locations in warehouses described as the size of 2 super Walmarts, the stockpile contained roughly $8 billion worth of medical supplies and had an annual budget of around $600 million for maintenance and restocking. The stockpile's official mission was to, quote, provide for the emergency health security of the United States. But confronted with the most severe health emergency in a century, it seemed to be woefully under-equipped. As patients inundated hospitals, health workers faced dire shortages of essential items, such as protective gear and ventilators. States vied with one another for scarce supplies as middlemen hiked prices by as much as 7-fold. Despite its vast scale, the federal stockpile was unable to make up for the shortfall in critical medical supplies. Meanwhile, there remained large quantities of items in the stockpile that were not helpful in responding to COVID-19, millions of doses of smallpox vaccine, as well as expansive supplies of anthrax treatment, and over 1,000 caches of nerve gas antidote. In this context, critical observers began to ask about the stockpile's apparent failure in the face of emergency. Why did the country's emergency medical storehouse lack the supplies that were essential for managing a pandemic? The answer was that it had been built with a different future in mind. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, security planners inhabited a post-Cold War world in which the major biological threat came from rogue nations and bioterrorists that it was surmised were equipped with weaponized strains of smallpox and anthrax. 2 decades after its establishment, the Strategic National Stockpile remained focused on the disease threats that had animated its original formation. When the head of the Office of Preparedness and Response, Robert Kadlec, was called before Congress to testify in the stockpile's failure to have sufficient supplies on hand, he acknowledged the limited scope of its managers' imagination. We did not consider a situation like today, he said. We thought about vaccines and therapeutics. We never thought about respirators being our first and only line of defense for healthcare workers. The ostensible mission of the stockpile was extensive to provide emergency health security. But in a world of limited resources, the question remained, security against what? 2 decades after the stockpile's establishment, biosecurity planners were still committed to the aging vision of the future that had shaped its initial formation. Thinking back to the packaged emergency hospital of the 1950s, we can point more generally to the temporal paradox of the stockpile. It's put together with a particular future in view, but its contents remain frozen in the moment of its assembly. Cadleck's testimony on the stockpile's failure brings me to a final element in the conceptual toolkit of preparedness that I want to discuss, what I'll call the post hoc diagnosis. And that is the examination in the aftermath of the event of what went wrong in the service of allocating blame and, in principle, improving preparedness for the next one. And there's been no shortage of such assessments of the US response to the coronavirus pandemic, from journalistic accounts to think tank reports to memoirs by former public health officials. Indeed, the process of post hoc diagnosis began well before the official end of the pandemic emergency in 2023. For instance, in April 2021, the Senate Committee on Homeland Security held a hearing on the federal government's preparation for and response to the pandemic. As the hearing opened, the committee chair noted that the US had been preparing and testing pandemic plans since 2005, prompting the question that the committee was supposed to answer of why the country had nonetheless suffered especially high mortality rates. In their testimony to the committee, witnesses pointed to a litany of technical and institutional sources of blame, from the CDC's faulty early testing to the fragility of the medical supply chain to confusion over leadership of the federal response. But one witness touched on a theme that went beyond these technical diagnoses. The former director of the CDC, Julie Gerberding, was asked about the very early stages of the outbreak in late February of 2020, when cases in the US had increased 1,000-fold. What steps, she was asked, could have been taken at that time to mitigate this rapid spread? Gerberding responded as an epidemiologist, reflecting on what had blinded experts to the fact that something novel was occurring and that a more proactive response was needed. In retrospect, she mused, public health officials should have understood that asymptomatic transmission was happening at an unprecedented rate. They should have seen that the disease was spreading widely, and instead they assumed that, like other coronaviruses, like MERS or SARS, the virus causing COVID-19 could only be transmitted by those with symptoms of the disease. And looking back at this period, Gerberding pointed out that sampling studies could have been done to predict where to go to look for cases, even when testing was not yet widely available. And here she suggested a diagnosis of the epidemiological failure. In a sense, this was a failure of imagination, a failure to appreciate that this wasn't going to be like SARS or MERS, where the efficiency of transmission from person to person was low. This was a disease that would spread like wildfire, and we responded as if it were business as usual. The past, in other words, weighed heavily on health authorities' interpretation of their present. When a novel coronavirus appeared, it was unimaginable at the outset that its key characteristics would be radically unlike previous coronavirus outbreaks. While the focus of Gerberding's response was on a failure of epidemiological imagination, her comments point us toward a broader range of questions. Insofar as we can consider governmental preparedness to hinge on the development of techniques of the imagination, we can ask, to what extent were these techniques able to anticipate the unprecedented? And did that which was difficult or impossible to imagine prove significant in contributing to its failure? As we have seen, officials implemented many long-standing preparedness measures at the outset of the pandemic, and these measures had some impressive accomplishments. For instance, closing down much of social life while keeping basic economic activities functioning, efficiently setting up medical facilities in urban areas, and stimulating the rapid development of novel vaccine candidates. Nevertheless, these measures proved in many cases to have unanticipated side effects or have been designed to address different problems than the coronavirus turned out to pose. To understand these unanticipated effects and the blind spots of preparedness devices, I've suggested we should examine the settings in which they were initially developed and the problems that were most salient to the experts who designed them. As for whether such an understanding will turn out to be useful in preparing for the next one, To address this question would require to ask what kind of next one we should anticipate. And this, it would seem, is a question that preparedness is ill-equipped to answer. Let me just close with a brief methodological postscript. The protagonists that I've been describing are concepts and devices that are brought to bear in an emergency and that, unbeknownst to their users, may carry with them tacit forms of rationality. I've sometimes been asked, where are the people in this story? My suggestion is that when we stayed home to flatten the curve, when we took a new COVID vaccine or hesitated to do so, or when we wondered whether we should still be wearing N95 masks in public places, our experience of the pandemic was mediated by the expert concepts and devices that gave the event a certain form and coherence. And yet we were more likely to be aware of the devices themselves than of the ways of thinking that were carried within them. In this sense, the forms of knowledge that I have been describing are not located diffusely in a cultural imagination or in a collective consciousness. In fact, their ambit may be rather circumscribed, situated in the decision tools wielded by often unknown government bureaucrats or think tank intellectuals. But insofar as they guide the work of authorities in governing an emergency, we may find ourselves under their influence. To analyze the limits of these techniques should not be mistaken as an attack on the authority of expert knowledge. Rather, it is an argument for experts and the rest of us to be aware of the assumptions that inhabit the tools we have inherited and that shape our decisions. Thank you.
Grab this microphone. Thank you so much, Andy. We have time for some questions in the room and questions online. I'll keep an eye on any that Karina might send through from the people watching online. But does anybody in the room have a question to kick us off? All right, I'll come to you.
Wonderful talk, and thank you very much for all the different points of view from the different books. But what struck me is that when we had the pandemic, all countries had the same dialogue, one. Second thing, it's interesting that you said 2 months or 4 months in Washington, they were doing the scenario. I think the exact scenario what we're going to experience, to me, it's like a red flag. It's like when someone just chucks a spanner in the works. Okay, this is going to happen. Then it happens. I'm not trying to be, but that's right. You really highlight. It's like that came out and I thought, wow, isn't that interesting? It's just an opinion, but what you already stated.
So you're interested in the timing of the exercise just a couple months before?
Yeah, the timing of the exercise, and then all over the planet, every broadcaster had the same dialogue, the same script, no matter where it was, Italy, France, Australia, if you go back, they all had the same, they were reading off the same playbook.
Yeah, well, that was what I tried to describe as this sort of global extension of pandemic preparedness in the mid-2000s around avian influenza. Via the World Health Organization, the US CDC created a template that was adopted by other countries around the world. And so that by the time of the coronavirus, most countries had similar plans available in anticipation of a possible pandemic.
You didn't answer that question about the timing.
The timing. Well, I can't speculate about it. I would say that I didn't actually mention, but there were constantly exercises being done. And so, I think it's something of a coincidence that this particular exercise was 2 months before, because, a year before that, there was a different exercise about a biological weapon. A year before that, there was an exercise on avian influenza. So you would just see going through a long history of repeated exercises.
Thank you very much for your answer. It's wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm American and I was in America when all this happened. And from what I remember, it seems to me that there was a lot of sabotaging, like within the political regime, like people really denying that it was a problem. Trump himself was denying that it was a problem and ridiculing Dr. Fauci, who was trying to give people actual advice. And I thought your talk was really great in terms of like how much can we prepare for what we don't know. But I feel like, isn't there an element of like, to some extent, this was like intentional sabotage, like downplaying it, and to an extent that I didn't see in other countries. Like it's kind of in a unique situation in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a counterfactual, there's an experiment that we can't run, which is, what would have happened had Hillary Clinton been the president at the outset of COVID-19?
Or like literally anywhere else.
And so I do not disagree with the chaotic nature of the Trump administration's response and his dismissal of scientific expertise and how polarized expert knowledge became in general along political lines, which was somewhat distinctive, I think, to the US, and it had to do with the particularities of the situation. By the same token, I'm trying to add something to that discussion, which I think is, the points are well taken, that there were also pieces of this that had to do with just the very limitations of pandemic preparedness planning and the need for flexibility. And there was a lack of flexibility, not only, I think, because of the failures of the administration's response, but also, this is a story that Michael Lewis, the journalist, for example, tells in his book about the pandemic, which I cited in one of my slides. Public health authorities themselves were also very defensive and in a highly politically polarized situation and stuck to their guns and in some cases acted more authoritative about what they knew, claimed that they knew more than they actually did about what the characteristics of the pathogen were, and that ended up undermining public trust in the expert knowledge. So I think that there were all that is to say, there are other parts of the story besides the fact that we had an anti-government president in the White House at the time of the pandemic.
Anybody else? Oh, so welcome. I should have said people should just say their name for Andy's benefit.
Hi, Andy. This hasn't fully crystallized in my head, so maybe you can help me with that. But it seems that when preparing for emergencies, I guess there's a school of thought, or historically it might have been thought, that we don't know if XYZ is going to happen. So there's a risk potentially on the horizon, but it may never happen. But with maybe more and more the case that we know these threats will manifest, we just don't know when and with what magnitude. So with climate-related hazards, we know that there will be significant bushfires, which are maybe not directly caused by climate change, but maybe this is also the case with pandemics and biosecurity. I'm wondering if does that mark a change at all, and is that actually in itself quite problematic for experts and potentially governments in terms of trying to corral the trust of publics when you know enough to identify these threats and you can almost say that they will happen, but you don't know, you're not able to fulfill the appetites of people for more specific knowledge?
Yeah, it's in a way why I started with the Cold War example of these medical stockpiles, because it was a constant problem for civil defense officials, that if you want to be at all prepared to survive a nuclear war, you're going to have to get civilians to get involved in planning for it and preparing for it and investing in it. You nonetheless hope that it doesn't happen. And so there's this problem of the event that could happen, and you have to, in some ways, give people a sense that it might well, even probably will happen in order to get action on it. But then when it doesn't happen, gradually, the public may get disillusioned with continuing to invest resources in it. I think climate change, pandemics, bioattacks, all are different kinds they all have different characteristics as threats. And they all do potentially lend themselves to preparedness. With climate change, I completely agree with you. You can certainly say now, maybe you couldn't 30 years ago, but you can certainly say now, these kinds of events are going to transpire. Stronger hurricanes, fires, heat waves, and we will need to adapt and prepare. With having observed the world of biological preparedness for 2 decades, there's a constant declaration of the following sentence: it's not a question of if, but when. I think that's a sentence that has to be taken with a little bit of grain of salt because it's from a constituency for preparedness. People who, let's say that you're a pharmaceutical company that has an anthrax vaccine candidate. You might want to say it's not a question of if, but when the United States will be attacked with anthrax. Or you might be a virology researcher specializing in avian flu. It's not a question of if, but when avian influenza will mutate to become easily transmissible among humans. Well, it turns out that didn't happen. And in fact, we did a lot of preparedness for anthrax and for avian influenza, and then something different happened. So I think that one can say there are likely to be new emerging diseases, but one doesn't really know what their characteristics are going to be or when they're going to appear. And so you probably need to have more generic capacities that you're articulating than a smallpox vaccine or than a tool for tracking the mutation of avian influenza among migratory waterfowl. You're going to need a strong public health system. You're going to need to have the public have confidence in the authority of public health experts. So I think you can orient the kind of preparedness you do given your uncertainty about the event that may or may not happen, if that helps.
I might just ask a follow-up, and then we'll go to Courtney and then Ray. Follow-up on that, Andy, is I guess the theme around imagination, right? As you said, one of the kind of drumbeats is this. Oh, well, we failed to imagine. And I guess that I wonder if you could say more about the types of imagination that is being pictured, because it seems to me it's we just need to imagine more various horrible possibilities, whereas that might not have even helped with this pandemic. That there are are there other genres of imagination that we need to be encouraging or thinking about or conceptualizing?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it gets to kind of what scenario planning can or cannot do. Herman Kahn, who's considered one of the early exponents of scenario planning, he was a Rand Corporation defense intellectual in the 1950s and 60s. Really emphasized the idea that he was like a screenwriter. His tool was imagination. His device for preparing us for a nuclear attack was to imagine to the last detail everything that was going to be needed. And so it was a kind of detailed imagination of a potential future event of the sort that a screenwriter might have. But I think you're right that can very likely lead you, let's say, down a rabbit hole of buying lots of radiation dosimeters and stocking bunkers with radiation dosimeters that are never going, hopefully, to be used. And that maybe it is the case that one really does want a different sort of imagination that is about forms of, as I was saying earlier, flexible capacity for a range of different events that are less about what a specific event might entail. But yeah.
Thank you. Courtney?
Thank you. Oh, excuse me. Thank you. That was great. I love how you structured that around these anticipatory devices. And in some respects, my question is maybe a permutation of Tim's, which is these devices, things like these scenario exercises, these preparedness indicators. It sort of sounds like there was quite a lot of consensus around them, that they were these effective tools that had a defined purpose and that were fit for that purpose. And my question is to what extent that is a correct impression. Like, were these kind of disputed either within expert communities or transnationally, perhaps, in any way? And then does that kind of flexibility or stability of those devices then shape how they were used in practice?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question that I have not thought about specifically, but I think you're right that in many cases they were fairly undisputed, at least within a community of practice. Mm-hmm. For example, the global health experts of whom there were many who agreed that these are the indicators that you need. Mm-hmm. Now, if you'd have asked them, will this be effective for a global respiratory virus, maybe they would have acknowledged, no, that's not really what these are for. Mm-hmm. But they also they're also invested in securing funding for the exercise of putting together these indicators. And so they wanted to make, to make a claim about the validity of these indicators across space and across multiple kinds of threats. The counterexample that I would give, just as I'm thinking through this, is the one about flattening the curve. which is interesting because that one was quite controversial around the mid-2000s. And there were experts in infectious disease who thought actually there's nothing you can do there's nothing helpful you can do to slow or contain the virus. It's going to have to go through the population. That respiratory viruses like flu just simply can't really be slowed or contained, and it's not worth trying. And so there was a fight within the CDC over whether to adopt these guidelines. In the end, the CDC did, at least somewhat tentatively. And I guess my point here is that in this case, there wasn't necessarily really full agreement among epidemiologists that it was going to work, but it was kind of the available thing, the way that a stockpile has these available supplies. And if you remember the sense of panic at the outset of the pandemic, when you were seeing the situation in Northern Italy and in China and in New York City, people wanted anything, and flattening the curve kind of fit the bill. This was something we could do. So that one, there wasn't necessarily expert consensus, but in many cases there seemed to be. Yeah, that's interesting.
Thanks for the presentation, Andrew. My name is Ray Tekia. I am a practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine here in Melbourne, and also a philosopher of science, wherein I look at the question of the relationship between traditional Chinese medicine and the practice of science. Now, going back to that question about preparedness for the coming pandemic, I would agree with Courtney, who mentioned about practice, the practice of dealing with an epidemic. And there is a lot of practice in dealing with epidemics in China. And that is one aspect that I had to look at when we had the SARS epidemic and also the COVID-19 pandemic that happened all over the world. What I did was I engaged with the evolving reality of a pandemic as it actually evolved from China, and then it developed into a worldwide pandemic. And in doing this, we had to put into life the practice of traditional Chinese medicine, which in short is it is the practice of differentiating clinical patterns and associating the appropriate medicinal substances, which I use in trying to look after some patients who are suffering from symptoms of upper respiratory tract infection, and then deal with it in accordance with the practice of TCM here in Melbourne. And if we do that, then we have in our capacity, in our resources, a lot of medical therapeutic practices that you can bear into dealing with a pandemic.
Is that a comment, Ray?
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Any other questions? I have one.
I have one as well.
All right. I think mine's mildly related, which is to go back to the question about, you mentioned screenwriters, and that made me think of your mentioning of Preston's book, Cobra Event, and Preston's other book, The Hot Zone. So if people don't know it, as other anthropologists have written about, The Hot Zone was this book, a novel about an Ebola-like virus that was very influential on people's imaginary, and particularly public health imaginaries of a virus like Ebola. And so I guess I'm kind of curious, having heard the presentation about your views on, we've talked about these devices. What about the role of popular cultural texts in our imaginaries of pandemics?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there was a very important moment, especially in the mid-90s. So Preston's book, The Hot Zone, was the Cobra event was a novel. The hot zone was actually journalism, originally published in the New Yorker, about this outbreak of an Ebola-like virus among macaque monkeys in a laboratory in Maryland. But it had this kind of frightening sensationalistic quality of like, this could have been this incredibly catastrophic outbreak that was barely contained and secretively so. Laura Garrett also wrote, who's a sort of science journalist who specialized in emerging diseases, wrote a book called The Coming Plague right around the same time, the mid-1990s. And so this was also the time when a Soviet bioweapons scientist emigrated from a former Soviet bioweapons scientist emigrated to the United States and kind of confessed about the vast Soviet bioweapons program that had produced, huge stockpiles of weaponized smallpox, and no one knew where those stockpiles were. So there was this kind of general anxiety and panic, both about diseases more like Ebola at this point, but also about a bioweapons attack. And the other thing to remember about this period is, of course, it's right after or still during the AIDS pandemic. And so the AIDS pandemic was always seen as kind of the harbinger. This gets back to your question about the next one. And so the idea was, well, we thought we public health authorities had thought we conquered infectious disease, with vaccines and sanitation systems and so on. But in fact, there are always these new ones popping up. And so it played an important role first in the world of expertise in the late 1980s and early 1990s, the idea of emerging diseases, and then it expanded to the public imagination via the books that we were talking about. But in terms of generating interest among the public and among congressional officials to support investment in biodefense research or in stockpiling or in planning, I think those public imagination-oriented movies and books were important.
Oh, thanks, Andy, for an amazing talk. I loved seeing pictures of Port Harcourt. I lived in Nigeria for some years, and not in 1969, though. What struck me was, when you talked about the time capsule and so on, I was just thinking that what is present for, in one country would be the future in another or the past in another. And to that extent, I feel even this idea that the response was the same in every country, I don't think that's actually quite true. It was, for example, it was not the same in Australia. We did talk about flattening the curve and so on, but we had a completely different response, and New Zealand for that matter. So I don't think, in fact, and of course, India was a completely other story as well. But what I wanted to talk about was, what you closed with in the end, and I wanted to kind of invite some more comment on that, which was really the politics of the mundane, the things that happen in bureaucracies and through kind of innocent systems that may not even be directly linked with the pandemic, but in fact have a huge impact. And is there a way to, now that we know that, or that's how it works, is there a way to operationalize them differently in the next pandemic? And the other question I had actually related to, again, what Courtney said about, the reports that came up. And I know in education, we have like major decisions being taken based on two 20-year-olds who sat in Deloitte or something and wrote up a report. Now, I know that these would be kind of maybe more legitimate kind of agencies that wrote the reports. But I think there's a lot of politics in that as well, in the sense that because they're always trapped for funding or not taken seriously, there's, I think, disagreement may be actually suppressed within those circles, at least to the outside world, because there's a lot of merit in their sticking together and, in the face of competing funding priorities and so on. Sorry, there's a number of different things, but respond to whichever of those you like.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that set of reflections because first of all, I agree with the first point about the heterogeneity of responses around the world. I think that's something that scholars should at least begin to do systematic comparisons. And there are some. In terms of the mundane devices and the ways in which bureaucracies may be kind of, as I said in the talk, hidebound and sort of attached to plans that have a certain systematicity, but that may not be relevant for the actual situation. I do think that there may be a way in which, if you're an authority in a bureaucracy, you feel responsible to the plan. And you're going to get in less trouble if you stuck to the plan and it doesn't work than if you do something outside of the plan, and maybe that will work. And so presumably there would be a need for leadership that would be more flexible. And this is the sort of story of like what would it have been like if there had been a more open-minded type of leader in the White House who was able to enable public health authorities to feel more confident. So I think that it's possible that sticking to the plan had to do with defending oneself against being held responsible later for a failure. In terms of, I mean, I think that you're getting at the kinds of analytic techniques that we have in science studies, and I tend it's tough. This is why Tim's advice not to write about the pandemic is good, because it's if you talk about this, you'll be asked what should we have been done. And as I started the talk saying, that's not my job, right? And yet people want to know, like, what should we do differently? And I think all I can say to that is the kinds of tools we have are to understand these tacit forms of reasoning that are embedded in devices, and that perhaps if experts and authorities were more conscious about those tacit forms of reasoning, they would feel freer to liberate themselves from a given technique that's not going to work. So that's perhaps what we might be able to offer to that world without being experts ourselves.
We have one more question in the room and one more question online. I'll just take the one online first, and then maybe that'll be it. So I have a question from Dev. He says, thank you for a great presentation. My name is Dev, and I'm a PhD student in Edinburgh from Thailand. I'd love to hear more about your thoughts on how health security, and by extension biosecurity, this is a big question, has been used to shape US society and global politics. It seems like the example of medical stockpiling speaks to that in a direct way.
Health security has been used. Can you repeat the last?
Health security and by extension biosecurity has been used to shape US society. I suppose, how has it shaped the texture maybe, or the structure of US society?
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's a single answer to that. I mean, I think that the moment that I would want to study that in, and I haven't myself studied it, would be the 2014 Ebola moment, because I think that was a period when there was tremendous unfounded anxiety about diseases coming from elsewhere, and there was a kind of collective panic. I mean, it was a catastrophe in West Africa. It was not a catastrophe in the United States. It was not likely to become a catastrophe in the United States, but there was a huge panic about, for example, humanitarian workers who had been exposed to the virus, whether they were going to be allowed into the country for treatment. And so you have the possibility of collective panic because a disease like Ebola, and COVID had its own degree of this, that's so spectacularly horrifying that it can encourage people to put up walls. And there are various ways in which US society likes to put up walls, and that was one of them in 2015 or 2014, 2015.
Great, thank you.
Thanks very much for that talk. I really enjoyed it. My name is Liam, and I'm an undergraduate at Deakin. One of the things I really liked your idea that sort of the devices and strategies that we stockpile in preparedness for crises embed assumptions about what they're going to look like, and that may not come to pass when they actually happen. It seems to me that COVID bore that out in one really significant respect, which is that particularly in Melbourne, as pandemic restrictions kind of wore on, one thing that became apparent was that there was a decreasing buy-in on the part of the public, in that the more restrictive the measures were and the longer that they went on, the more that people kind of opted out and developed various countermeasures. And there was a knock-on effect in that it wasn't just that people were dodging restrictions, people stopped trusting expert knowledge of all types. They stopped buying into the kind of broader project of public health. Late last year, the Australian government put out a report, the COVID response inquiry summary. And one of their top-level conclusions is that we cannot count on the public adhering to our recommendations in the next crisis. So my question to you is, one, do you anticipate that there might be some countermeasures for future crises that are concerned with rebuilding public trust or shoring it up? And two, if there were such measures, what form might they take?
Yeah, well, it's interesting to hear. I think that we had a kind of exacerbated version of what you had here, what you just described. I mean, it's a very good point in terms of the public growing gradually disillusioned as the measures seem to go on indefinitely. And that, I alluded earlier to the critique of the idea of flattening the curve among some public health officials back in the early 2000s. And I think they were wary of exactly this thing that school closures, for example, were going to have a major effect on people, whether they were able to work, whether kids were able to learn, and so on, and that there would be resistance, and that might indeed undermine public trust in officials, and that's what happened. So the answer is, indeed, that was one of the examples of a measure that was implemented without a lot of, at least at the time, forethought about its being able to convey to the public, how long are we going to do this? What is our rationale here? And I think the public got disillusioned because experts were, in the US at least, overly confident in their own authority to make these decisions, and gradually resistance grew. And it was at the time, especially politically polarized, as we were discussing earlier in the US, because it was seen as a kind of blue state phenomenon, and not the red states, and the right was the site of rebellion against these nanny state strictures. In terms of future ways to defend against it, I mean, again, it's a place where I'm loath to make recommendations. I will cite the field of risk communication, which is not my field, but which I think has some insights that were surprisingly not followed by public health authorities in the US, from what I could tell. And they actually argue for humility on the part of public health officials. And they say, the way to develop trust is to let people know both what you do know and what you don't know. And in fact, be quite clear about what you don't know. And if you show overconfidence and it turns out that you were wrong, like you don't think that the disease is airborne and it turns out to be airborne, that will undermine trust more than having said at the outset, we're still studying how this disease is transmitted. And so it's interesting. I don't know the reason why CDC officials did not follow that kind of recipe that comes from the field of risk communication, but I don't think they did a great job of that.
Thanks, Andy. A note of humility is a good place to end it, as we are humbled by your great presentation. I wonder if anybody in the room and online can join me in thanking again Andy and Apple. Thanks for the great questions. The last closing note I need to make is, as I mentioned at the beginning, the Deakin Sciences Society Network, we're having a big event here on 8th of July, doing interdisciplinarity, 6 years of the Science and Society Network. Do look it up and register and come along. It's going to be a great day. And thank you, everybody, for coming.